I was never much for talking about myself, not out loud, not where another man could measure the shake in my voice and make a judgment of it. A cowboy learns early to keep his weather inside. Wind on the plains does the speaking anyway. It hisses through grass, knocks an old gate half open, and tells on you when you are not steady. But there comes a time when a man has to make his peace with memory to let the dust settle where it will. The years have thinned to a narrow trail behind me, and the tracks I left are not as certain as they once were. Still, I can follow them back to the place where I first knew what I was meant to do, with whatever strength was left in me. They called the town Redemption Springs, as if a name alone could coax mercy out of rock. It sat low and tired along the creek, one street of false fronts and swinging signs, a church with a peeling steeple, a schoolhouse painted white that the sun turned yellow by late summer. You could smell the iron in the water and the pride in people who had not yet learned to be gentle with each other. I rode into it on a day when the sky was the color of a faded work shirt, the heat standing in the road like a stranger who would not move out of your way. I had been hired to manage the McCrae cattle for a year, maybe two if the grass held and the owners stayed out of their own business. I told myself I was there to work and keep quiet, to make my bed where evening found me and not ask anything of anyone. I was watering my horse at the trough behind the general store when I heard the first whisper about her. Two women moving past with baskets on their arms and the porch boards creaking under them, voices pitched low in that careful way people use when they mean to be cruel, but wish to look like they are not. Poor thing, one of them said. The schoolteacher, pretty as a June morning, but barren as a salt flat. I remember the feel of the reins in my hand, the leather warm, the mare blowing a little steam in the shod. Barren, the woman said, and the word stuck like a grass burr under the collar. Folks out here had a way of taking one fact, or what they believed to be a fact, and building a fence around a soul with it. I had seen it before. I had lived the consequence of it in a house where sorrow collected in corners like unwashed dishes. It made me hard in a quiet manner, the kind of hardness that does not break a thing but will not bend for it. That afternoon, I rode the fence south of town and came back near dusk. Light was falling behind the cottonwoods, freckled gold slipping through leaves, the creek making a pale sound like someone thinking out loud. I passed the schoolhouse without meaning to look. The windows were open to let heat escape. It was then I saw her gathering readers into a satchel, chalk dust on the blue hem of her dress. Her hair was braided loose and lifted when the breeze came through. A little lift, as if it were surprised to be touched. She did not see me. I cannot say what set my heart to leaning in that moment. Maybe it was how calm she was. Maybe it was how the room behind her looked cleaned of despair. There are people like that who do a secret job of making the air kinder around them. A man who has spent enough nights talking only to his horse will know the feeling when it comes. You learn to turn your eyes away from what you cannot hold. So I looked back at the road and rode on. But the next morning, I sat my coffee slow on the porch of the bunkhouse and noticed the sound of the bell from the school at 9, and at noon, and again at 3 when she let the pupils spill into the yard. In the evenings, when the work was put away, and the men dragged their laughter across the cook fire, I found reasons to man tack in town, to buy nails and tobacco I did not need. I told myself it was nothing. A man tells himself many things just to hear a voice. I learned her name by accident, or fate, if you put stock in such accounting. Josephine. A child called it from the gate, tugging at her skirt because he had left his slate inside. She smiled at him, and the smile worked on me from half a street away. I do not believe in the thunderclap kind of love, the high talk that sells songs and ruins men. What I felt was something quieter, something like shade appearing where none had been. There is mercy in shade. There is also danger in it for a man who has taught himself to go without. Evenings grow long on the plains in late summer. The sky stretches its light thin as gauze, and you can see a whole day's sorrow lifted like smoke if you stand still long enough. I walked past the schoolhouse once when the children were practicing their lines for the Founders' Day recitation. Josephine stood by the door with a paper in her hand, steadying a girl whose voice shook like a loose screen. The girl got through it, and the others clapped softly, shy of their own noise. I remember thinking that a thing is not small just because it is quiet. That thought went into my pocket and stayed there. The town kept its own council, which is to say, it repeated the same story until it believed it. Men spoke of cattle, weather, and women in the same breath, as if all three could be counted by the pound. I kept my mouth shut. I had known a different sorrow, and it taught me to guard the living from the judgments of the living. My sister once carried a silence so heavy it bent the skins on our boots. I was young then, and did not know what to do with grief that had no name. Redemption Springs had names for everything, but I had learned enough to mistrust a town that enjoyed such certainty. It was near sundown the first time she spoke to me. I had tied my mare to the hitching rail by the cafe, washed my hands in the pump water that smelled faintly of tin, and was studying the chalkboard menu as if it held the answer to a question no one had asked. She stepped up beside me with a ledger under her arm, nodded once and said the pie was better on Wednesdays because Mrs. Ortega baked on Tuesdays and it had time to settle by then. I said I would remember it and ordered coffee anyway. She ordered tea because the day had left a taste in her mouth, and we stood with our cups not facing one another, watching dust lift off the road where two boys were kicking a ball of rags back and forth. We spoke of small things at first, the heat, the creek running low, a hawk nesting in the cross beam of the church, and the preacher too kind to disturb it. Then the talk bent and made a truer shape, like a horse that has decided you are not an enemy. I heard myself say that I had taken a contract with the McCraes. She said she taught letters to children whose fathers were too tired to dream them anymore. Her voice had a way of answering a question before I thought to ask it. When she smiled, it was not a performance. It was an agreement with the day that it had not been wasted. I could feel other eyes on us. A small town is a mouth that never quite closes. If she noticed, she did not let it show. She finished her tea. I finished my coffee. The sun went down behind the cottonwoods and left the sky the pale blue of something held underwater. She gathered her ledger and said she hoped I found the creek tomorrow, looking less worried. I told her I hoped the children found the courage to speak their lines loud. We parted with the kind of silence that feels like a prayer that forgot it was a prayer. That night, the wind rose and pressed at the eaves of the bunkhouse. Sleep came late. The mare shifted in the corral and blew through her nose like a kettle. I lay on my back and watched the moon drag its tin plate across the windows. I thought of that word I had heard, the cruel one, and felt a hot flash of anger at people who make conclusions of what is not theirs to decide. Then I let the anger go because a cowboy's life is too long for carrying it. In its place, something else settled, a resolve maybe, or the simple hope that a kind woman might walk a stretch of road with me while the season held. When dawn came, it brought that thin coolness the plains sometimes remember in their bones. I saddled up, tied my bedroll, and headed south along the fence line. The sun gathered itself, slow, and the land opened, unashamed of its scars. I rode through grass that had learned how to keep what little water it could. I watched antelope lift their heads and reconsider me. I mended wire, marked a broken post, and thought of nothing for blessed minutes at a time. By afternoon, when I turned back, I knew two things with a clarity that felt like rain. The first was that I would attend the Founders' Day dance, because there are certain crossroads a man must not ride past. The second was that wherever this led, I meant to carry it with steadiness and without apology. A life is only as true as the way a man shoulders it. That evening I shaved, which is to say, I dragged a dull blade over a face I had not studied in weeks. I oiled my boots. I brushed the horse until her coat held a light, like a secret, and somewhere inside me a low bell began to sound, not loud, but sure. I do not mistake bells for weddings anymore. Some ring for warning, some for fire, and some only because metal wants to sing when it is struck. But it called me toward town, and I went. The Founders' Day dance was held in the old Grange Hall, the one with the warped floorboards that moaned when folks tried to waltz too proud. The whole town turned out, men in shirts brushed clean for once, women in dresses smelling of starch and faint perfume. Lanterns hung from the rafters to chase off the moths and the memories both. Outside, the air still held the day's heat, but inside, it was easy to forget there had ever been a world past those open doors. I stood near the wall at first, the way a man does when he doesn't yet know his place. A fiddle started up, thin and reedy, and the rhythm came from boot heels on pine. The mayor gave a short speech about progress. The preacher said a prayer about humility, and the town carried on without listening too close to either one. I kept my hat low, my eyes on the pattern of lantern light wobbling over the floor until a soft voice called my name. "Mr. Vaughn, you came after all." She was there in a gray-blue dress, simple but alive with the light around it. Her hair was coiled up, a few strands loose, as if freedom refused to be pinned entirely. For a heartbeat, I forgot the rules that say a cowboy should be careful with beauty. I nodded, and she smiled that small, knowing smile of hers. "I thought maybe you'd changed your mind," she said. "I nearly did," I told her, but my horse argued otherwise. That earned a laugh, quiet, genuine. We spoke of small things again, because sometimes the small talk keeps the bigger truth from scaring off too soon. She told me the children had practiced hard all week for their recitations, and that she burned her first batch of biscuits that morning, too distracted to mind the oven. I said every man in town had been thinking about pie since she'd mentioned it at the cafe, and she shook her head, pretending not to understand the flattery. When the fiddler struck the opening of a slower tune, she hesitated, glancing toward the couples already circling. I offered my hand, rough palm upward, not demanding, just there if she wanted it. She took it like she was reaching for something she'd lost once and had nearly stopped believing in. Her hand was small, but certain. We moved with the music, careful at first, finding the measure of each other. Her head was near enough that I caught the faint scent of cedar and chalk. The floor creaked. Someone laughed too loud. A child shouted from the doorway, and still the moment held. "I'm not very good at this," she said, her eyes lowered. "I don't reckon anyone's born knowing," I told her. "You just listen close and trust the other person's still there when you turn." She looked up then, and in that instant, the noise faded. It's a strange thing, the way a hall full of people can disappear until there's just one face, one pair of eyes, the low sound of a bow over strings marking time for your heartbeat. I thought of all the words I'd heard about her, the whispered pity, the judgment wrapped in concern, and none of them mattered a whit against what I saw. We danced another song, then another. When the air grew heavy, we stepped outside, the night washing over us cool and dry. The stars had come out, clear and sharp as new-cut glass. Crickets carried on their business in the grass. She leaned against the railing of the porch, the wood pale in the moonlight. "They'll talk about this," she said after a while. "Let 'em," I said. "Talking's what keeps 'em from choking on their own secrets." Her laugh was soft, but there was a sadness hiding in it. "You don't know them yet." "I know enough of people," I said, "and I know you've got nothing to be ashamed of." That stopped her. She turned to me, eyes darker than the night behind her. "You've heard what they say." "I have." "And you still came?" "I came because I wanted to." I paused, searching for words that wouldn't break the fragile air between us. I've learned that what folks say usually tells more about them than about the one they're saying it about. Her gaze dropped to her hands. "They think I can't have children. It doesn't matter how much good I do in that classroom. They look at me and see something missing." I let her words settle before I spoke. "I've seen what real emptiness looks like, Josephine. You don't carry that kind." She blinked at that, a little startled maybe by the sound of her name in my mouth. I didn't push. A man can't heal another's wound by pressing on it. I just stood beside her, listening to the wind threading through the cottonwoods, the same steady breath that had carried over these plains long before either of us came to them. When the lanterns burned low inside, we said good night. She thanked me for the dance. I tipped my hat, and we walked our separate ways down the same stretch of road, the distance between us filled with something that didn't feel like emptiness at all. For a few days after, I kept to the range. Work piled up, fences needed mending, and cattle don't wait on a man's heart to settle itself. But every evening, when I rode back through the outskirts of town, I'd see the soft light from the schoolhouse window and the outline of her shadow moving behind the curtain. Sometimes she was reading, sometimes sewing. Once I caught her laughing at something unseen. Each time, I felt that same quiet pull, the one that starts in a man's chest and reminds him that solitude is not the same as peace. The weather turned sudden that week, as it does in the high plains, heat giving way to a wind that carried grit sharp enough to sting the eyes. The sky hung low and bruised. I stopped by the mercantile for supplies and found Josephine there, bent over a list, arguing gently with the clerk about the cost of chalk. She looked up when I entered, a quick flicker of recognition that she tried to hide. "You ride in all this dust?" she asked. "I ride in worse," I said, brushing my hat against my thigh. "A man gets used to squinting at the world." She smiled. "That doesn't sound like comfort." "Maybe not," I said, "but it keeps you from missing what's right in front of you." She folded the list and slid it into her bag. "There's lemonade at the schoolhouse. If you're passing by later, stop in. It's too much for one person." That was how it started. The small kindness of a shared drink on a hot day. I sat on the steps while she poured from a chipped pitcher, the lemon scent cutting through the dust like something holy. Children's drawings fluttered on the walls inside, crude horses and blue mountains that looked nothing like the real ones. She watched me study them. "They draw what they hope to see," she said. "Sometimes that's better than what's true." I looked at her then, at the calm in her posture, the way her voice carried no bitterness, only weariness smoothed by time. "And what do you hope to see, Josephine?" She hesitated. "Just kindness, I suppose, the kind that stays after it's been tested." Her words settled into me like a promise I hadn't made yet. I left before the light faded, but her voice followed me all the way back to the ranch, lingering in the air like dust after hooves. That night, while the rest of the men played cards, I sat outside by the fire, turning her words over and over. The flames moved slow, the way time does when a man starts to remember what longing feels like. Somewhere out beyond the hills, a coyote called, long and low, and I found myself answering it in silence. The next morning, the sky cleared. The wind had scoured everything clean. I saddled up with a strange sense of purpose. There's a moment, just before you ride out, when the world pauses to see what kind of man you'll be that day. I felt it then, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't turn away from it. There's a sort of quiet that settles over a man when he finally admits what he wants. Not the restless kind that prowls around a bunkhouse at night, but the steadier one that comes after years of dust and miles. It was that kind of quiet that rode with me the morning I found Josephine down by the creek. The water had thinned to a silver ribbon, shallow and slow, running through reeds that had turned the color of straw. She was kneeling near the edge, skirt tucked beneath her, trying to coax a broken branch free from the current. I dismounted, the leather creaking, the sound of my boots startling a bird from the cattails. She looked up and smiled, like it was the most natural thing in the world that I'd appear there, though neither of us had spoken of meeting. "The creek's stubborn today," she said, like the rest of us. "Can't say I blame it," I answered, stepping closer. "Too many people wanting it to move faster than it can." We worked together to clear the snag, and for a while we didn't talk at all. The sun climbed slow behind the willows, throwing pale light over her shoulders. I remember thinking she didn't seem out of place here. The land had its own language, and somehow she spoke it without saying a word. When the branch finally drifted free, she stood brushing her hands. "You ever wonder," she said, "if the land remembers who we were before we tried to change it?" "All the time," I told her, "but I reckon it forgives us, same as it forgives the river for running crooked." She looked at me then, eyes soft but searching, and I knew she'd seen something in me that I hadn't quite shown. We walked back toward the schoolhouse, taking the long path along the cottonwoods. The air was full of grasshoppers, the sound of them like tiny matches striking. She talked about her students, how some came hungry, how others came carrying more than lessons could fix. I listened, and every word deepened the stillness inside me. "I keep hoping," she said, "that if I teach them enough words, they'll learn the ones that heal." I said, "Maybe you already are." She didn't answer, just smiled that half smile again, the kind that felt more like understanding than joy. A few days later, a letter arrived at the ranch, an invitation written in a careful hand. Josephine was holding a small picnic for her pupils to celebrate the end of term, and she'd asked me to help with the horses. I remember sitting with the paper in my hands longer than needed, tracing the curve of her name. That Saturday, the fields were thick with sunlight. I rode in early, leading 2 ponies borrowed from the McCraes. The children ran circles around me, their laughter bright and wild. Josephine was arranging jars of lemonade on a table beneath the cottonwood shade. When she saw me, she lifted her hand, shading her eyes. "Mr. Vaughn," she called, "you're early." "Habit," I said. "Well, cattle don't wait for clocks." She laughed, the sound softer than the wind in the grass. The day passed easy. Children eating biscuits, chasing one another, trying to climb where no one should. I helped a boy up into the saddle, his face all sunlight and fear, and when he finally sat steady, he grinned at me as if I'd given him the world. Josephine stood nearby, her eyes full of something I didn't yet have the courage to name. When the children left and the noise faded, we stayed behind to gather what was left, the cups, the crumbs, the trampled grass that would remember us until morning. She said, "You're good with them." I shrugged. "Your children don't expect much, just the truth." "That's more than most people give," she said. We carried the empty jars back toward town. Halfway there, clouds began building over the ridge, low and purple, carrying that smell of rain the earth waits for all summer. She walked beside me, her hand brushing the back of mine once, not by accident, but not by intention either. The thunder was distant then, still polite. "I like the sound of storms," she said, "and they remind me that the sky still has a temper." "Seems fair," I said. "The land's been patient long enough." She smiled, and we kept walking. When we reached the school porch, the first drops began to fall, slow and deliberate. We stood under the awning and watched the dust turn to dark patches on the road. The smell of wet cedar filled the air. She said, "You best wait it out. The trail gets slick." I nodded, grateful for the excuse. Inside, the air was cool, the chalkboard half cleaned, maps curling at the corners. She lit a lamp, and the small flame painted gold on her cheek. I sat on the edge of a desk while she gathered books into stacks. "This place suits you," I said. "It's all I have," she replied. The storm deepened. The rain came harder, hammering the roof. For a moment, we couldn't hear anything else. She stopped sorting papers and looked out the window, eyes far away. "Sometimes," she said, "I think the world decided what my life would be before I got the chance to argue." I wanted to tell her that no one gets to make peace with the world until they've fought it a little, but I stayed quiet. Words are a poor fence if you don't know which side you mean to stand on. When the thunder cracked close, she startled, her hand gripping the table. I rose and crossed to the window, checking the latch. The wind pushed back hard, a loose shutter banging against the siding. I caught it, closed it tight, felt the rain cold on my sleeve. She thanked me, her voice small in the noise. "It'll pass," I said. Storms always do. I know, she said. It's the waiting that's hard. Something in the way she said it made my chest tighten. We stood there, the two of us, with the lamp flickering and the storm pressing at the glass. It felt like the world outside had been stripped away, leaving just the sound of our breathing and the slow drip from the eaves. When the rain eased, we stepped onto the porch. The road gleamed in the moonlight. The air washed clean. She tilted her face upward, letting the last drops touch her. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not asking what everyone else wants to know." I looked at her then, at the way the night caught in her hair, the quiet in her eyes. Some things a man's got to let find their own telling. She nodded, and I saw the faintest tremor of relief pass through her. I didn't reach for her hand, though every instinct begged me to. I just tipped my hat and said I'd see her Sunday at church, though I hadn't stepped foot inside in months. As I rode back to the ranch, the moon was rising, full and pale, dragging its reflection along the creek like a coin through dust. I thought about her words, about the waiting. I'd done my share of it, waiting for rain, for cattle to fatten, for the ache of old wounds to fade. But this felt different. This was the kind of waiting that came with a heartbeat and a name. By the time I reached the bunkhouse, the fire had burned down to embers. The men were asleep, their snores tangled with the sighing of the wind. I lay awake for a long while, listening, remembering the look on her face when the thunder rolled close. And somewhere in that long quiet, I made a promise I didn't speak aloud, that whatever storm came next, I wouldn't leave her to face it alone. The heat came back with a vengeance the week after the storm, the kind that makes a man feel like the world's been holding its breath too long. Dust hung in the air even before you set your boot down, and the cattle moved slow under the sun, their hides rippling with flies. Work was steady, and that's what I told myself I needed. Steady hands, steady heart. But steadiness is a poor disguise for longing. I hadn't seen Josephine since that night, not proper. I passed the schoolhouse once or twice, always meaning to tip my hat, always finding some reason not to stop. There's a danger in getting used to silence. It starts to feel like safety. Still, every evening, when I'd wash up at the pump behind the bunkhouse, I'd catch the scent of wet earth and think of her porch after the rain. Then one afternoon, the foreman sent me into town for supplies. I tied my mare outside the mercantile, stepped into the dim, cool air of the place, and there she was, bent over a ledger, same as before, but her face looked drawn. She smiled when she saw me, though it took her a second to make it reach her eyes. "You again," she said, much beginning to think the McCrays have you running their errands just to keep me company. "Maybe they do," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm not one to question a good assignment." She laughed, but it broke halfway through, the sound catching like a thread on a nail. I asked if she was all right, and she waved it off, said it was just the heat. But when the clerk went to fetch the sugar she'd ordered, her hand went to the edge of the counter as if she needed something solid beneath her. "You ought to sit," I said. "You're pale." "It'll pass," she whispered, though her voice wasn't sure. I took the list from her hand before she could argue. "Tell you what," I said. "You sit a spell. I'll fetch what you need." Maybe it was the way I said it. Maybe she was just too tired to protest. Either way, she nodded and sank into the chair near the door. When I came back with the parcels, she looked steadier, though her fingers still trembled. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," I told her, "but it didn't seem right to watch you fall over out of pride." That got me a real smile, wary but honest. We walked together down Main Street toward the schoolhouse, the sun slanting low, throwing long shadows across the road. A wagon rolled past. A couple of men nodded. A few women turned to whisper behind gloved hands. I felt their eyes on us, the way folks stare when kindness looks too much like scandal. When we reached her porch, she stopped and said softly, "You shouldn't walk me home like this." "Why not?" "Because people talk." "Let 'em," I said again, though I could tell it pained her more than she'd ever admit. She rested her hand on the railing, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "You don't understand. Out here a woman's name is all she has." "I understand enough," I said, "and if mine can help guard it, then I don't see harm in that." Her eyes lifted to mine, wide with something between gratitude and fear. "You shouldn't make promises like that." "I'm not promising," I said, "just stating what's already true." She looked away first. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy, like the air before lightning. Then she said, "Would you like some tea?" "It's too hot for it, but I could use the company." I followed her inside, where the air was cooler. The room smelled faintly of chalk and lavender, the kind of scent that settles on a man's memory and never leaves. She poured tea from a pot chipped along the rim, and we sat at the small wooden table by the window. For a while, neither of us said much. The sound of cicadas outside filled the spaces where words might have gone. Then, without looking up, she said, "There was a time I thought I'd marry, a long time ago. I waited, knowing better than to fill the pause. It ended before it began," she said finally. "He was kind, but he wanted a family, children. When the doctor told me I couldn't, well, he went east, found someone who could, my gosh." The words came quiet, but there was no bitterness, only the weariness of something long accepted. "I'm sorry," I said. "Don't be," she answered. "I've made my peace with it." She looked out the window, her voice barely more than a breath. Or I thought I had. I didn't trust myself to speak. The light coming through the glass caught the dust in the air, tiny specks turning like gold. She set her cup down carefully, as if it might shatter under the weight of what she hadn't said. "You ever feel," she asked, "like the world's waiting for you to prove something you never agreed to prove?" "All the time," I said, "but I've learned the world's not much of a judge. It forgets what it said soon enough." She turned then, and for the first time there wasn't distance in her gaze, just a kind of quiet recognition, as if she'd found someone who'd been walking the same road without knowing it. We talked until the sun fell behind the ridge, our words slow, careful, like stepping through tall grass. When I stood to leave, she followed me to the door. "Thank you," she said again, "for the tea, for not treating me like I'm broken." I wanted to tell her she wasn't, that she was more whole than anyone I'd met in that town, but the words caught somewhere between my heart and my throat, and all I managed was, "You should rest." "I will," she said. "You too." Outside, the evening wind had cooled, carrying the smell of sage. I walked back toward the livery, the sound of her voice still with me, soft as the rustle of dry grass. That night, the sky burned with stars. The men at the ranch were still awake, laughing loud over cards and whiskey, but I couldn't bring myself to join. I sat apart, staring into the fire until the wood collapsed into glowing coals. I thought about Josephine, about the quiet strength it took to face a world that measured her by what she couldn't give. I thought about how easily she'd smiled through pain she never named. And I thought about my own ghosts, my sister, lost years ago to a sorrow no one had the words for. Maybe that's why Josephine's silence spoke so clearly to me. I knew the sound of that kind of loneliness. I lived in it, worn it like an old coat, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something shift inside me, like a door that had been closed for years creaking open just enough to let the light in. When the fire burned low and the night wind cooled the embers, I finally lay down. The stars above the plains were steady, patient, as they'd always been. But I couldn't help feeling that one of them had begun to move, slow and certain, drawing me toward a future I hadn't dared imagine. The summer stretched on, dry and endless. Each day started the same. The sound of boots scraping dust from the porch, the low bell of the McCrae herd moving through morning haze, the clang of the cook's pan, calling us to coffee strong enough to scrape paint. Routine has a way of keeping a man safe from his own thoughts, but only for so long. Josephine's face kept finding me, in the shimmer above the plains, in the soft echo of a woman's voice when the wind turned the right way. I started stopping by the schoolhouse on Saturdays, under one excuse or another. Sometimes I brought fence wire for her to use in the garden, sometimes a stray book from the ranch owner's wife, pretending it needed returning. The children had gone home for the summer, so the place sat quiet, her handwriting still chalked across the board like a memory. The first time I found her there, alone, she was painting a shelf the color of sage. Her hair was pinned up, but coming loose from the heat, the back of her neck flushed with sun. I stood in the doorway, hat in hand. She didn't look up. "You plan on staring all day, Mr. Vaughn," she said, "or will you hand me that brush I dropped?" I bent, picked it up, and crossed the floor. "You always paint alone?" "Always," she said, smiling without turning. "It saves me from giving instructions twice." I laughed, and the sound startled us both. It had been a long time since I'd heard myself laugh like that. We talked easy that afternoon, about pain and weather, about how the creek ran slower each year. When the sun dropped behind the ridge, I offered to fix the latch on her door, which stuck whenever the wind came from the east. She thanked me, though I suspected she didn't mind if it stayed stuck. Weeks passed like that. Quiet visits, small repairs, a rhythm neither of us named, but both understood. She poured tea. I'd sit by the window, and the world would shrink to the space between our words. I started learning the details a man only catches when he's paying real attention. The way she smoothed her thumb along the rim of a cup when thinking, the soft hum she made while writing lesson plans, the little sigh she gave before speaking of herself. One evening, I brought her a book of poems from the bunkhouse. She read the first line aloud, smiling. "You like poetry, Mr. Vaughn?" "I like truth," I said. "And sometimes that's where it hides." She looked at me then for a long moment. "You surprise me." "I surprise myself," I said. "Most days, I'm just trying to make it through without offending the sky." That made her laugh, and it sounded like the kind of music you don't dare talk over. It was around then the drought broke, A storm rolled down from the hills, sudden and mean, throwing lightning wide across the plains. The rain came so hard it turned the road to a river of mud. I was heading back from town when I saw her figure at the edge of the schoolyard, struggling to close the shutters against the wind. I rode straight there, rain slapping the brim of my hat, horse skittish beneath me. She didn't see me until I was beside her, catching the shutter before it tore free. "Stubborn thing," she shouted over the wind. "Which one of us?" I said. Her eyes flashed, rain running down her face. "Both." We wrestled the latch shut, soaked through, laughing like fools. Inside, the air was cold and damp, the storm beating at the roof. I found a match and lit the small stove in the corner while she fetched blankets from the cupboard. "You'll catch cold," she said. "I've caught worse," I told her. She shook her head, handing me a towel. Always an answer. "Always a question to earn it," I said. We sat by the stove as it warmed, our clothes steaming. The storm outside turned to a steady roar, the kind that makes the world feel smaller and safer than it is. She poured coffee, hands trembling just enough for me to notice. After a while she said, "I've never been good at being cared for." "That's not something you need to be good at," I said. "You just have to let it happen." She looked down at her cup. "And if it ends?" "Everything ends, John," I said. "But that doesn't mean it wasn't worth starting." Her eyes lifted to mine then, full of a kind of fear that looked too much like hope. The thunder cracked above us, close enough to shake the walls. She flinched, and I reached for her hand without thinking. It was small and cold, and she didn't pull away. For a long moment, the only sound was rain and our breathing. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. "You don't even know what you're getting yourself into." "Maybe not," I said, "but I know what I'm standing in." Her lips parted, like she meant to say more, but the words didn't come. Instead, she squeezed my hand once, and then let go, turning back to the window. We waited for the storm to move on, and when it did, the world outside was quiet as a confession. The air smelled of wet cedar and forgiveness. I saddled my horse under the fading rain, and she walked me out to the gate. "Be careful," she said. "I always am." "That's what worries me." I smiled, touched the brim of my hat. "See you tomorrow." "If the roof holds," she said. As I rode off, I looked back once. She stood on the porch, hair undone, lamplight behind her. The road glistened under the moon like it had been newly made. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing her voice, soft under the thunder, saying she wasn't good at being cared for. I understood that more than she knew. I'd spent half my life turning kindness away before it had the chance to wound me. But with her, the armor didn't fit right anymore. By morning, the air had changed. The dust was gone. The grass bent low and green, and the sky wore that washed-out look that only comes after rain. I saddled my mare and rode south to check the fences, but my thoughts were already heading back toward town. Something had begun between us, something small, careful, like a seed that had waited too long for water. I didn't know what shape it would take, or if the land would be kind enough to let it grow. All I knew was that for the first time in years, the road ahead didn't feel so lonely. The weeks that followed the storm felt like a kind of peace I hadn't earned. The land softened, the grass took on a hint of green, and the air smelled clean again, like someone had wrung the dust out of the sky. Work stayed steady, but my mind wandered more than it should have. Every mile I rode, I caught myself thinking of Josephine, her voice when it went quiet, the calm in her eyes when the world turned mean. I saw her nearly every Sunday after that. At church, she'd sit near the back, hat small and plain, gloves folded in her lap. I wasn't much for sermons, but I learned to stand through them if it meant hearing her sing the hymns under her breath. Afterward, we'd walk the road home together. She'd carry a basket of books, and I'd find a way to take the weight from her. One afternoon, we stopped under the shade of a cottonwood, and she said, "You don't have to keep doing that." "Doing what?" I asked, walking me home. "People are starting to notice." "I noticed." I said, "Ma, that's enough." She sighed, looking down at the dust around her boots. "You make things sound simple." "They usually are till folks start talking." Her smile flickered. "And they always do." The truth of it hung between us, heavy as the air before a storm. I wanted to tell her I didn't give a damn about talk, but that wasn't quite true. I'd lived long enough to know words could ruin what bullets never could. That night, I dreamed of my sister again, the one I lost before the war, before I ever knew what loneliness could cost. In the dream, she was standing by the river near our father's ranch, the same way she'd stood the morning she told me she was leaving. She loved a man who loved something else more. His pride, maybe, or the way the world bowed to him. When she couldn't give him a child, he left. She stayed long enough to watch the town turn its back on her, and then she was gone, swallowed by silence and rumor. I woke with that ache lodged deep, the kind that never quite works itself out. It was near dawn, the bunkhouse quiet. I stepped outside and let the cool air clear my head. Somewhere far off, a coyote called. The sound trailed across the plains like a memory that refused to fade. Later that day, I found Josephine by the church well, drawing water for the garden behind the schoolhouse. She looked tired, though she tried to hide it with a smile. "You been sleeping?" I asked. "Some," she said, "when enough to dream, which is both blessing and curse." "What about?" "Nothing worth telling." She hesitated. "You?" I looked toward the horizon, where the sun was bleeding into the hills. "Ghosts." She nodded like she understood, though I hadn't given her a name for any of them. The next weekend, the town held its harvest fair. I wasn't planning to go, but she asked if I might help her bring in some tables from the church. It was an excuse, maybe, but a welcome one. By the time I got there, she was already setting up. Her sleeves rolled past her elbows, a smudge of flour on her cheek. The hall smelled of cinnamon and apples. She handed me a crate of jars to carry. "You always this prepared?" I asked. "Only when I'm nervous," she said. People expect perfection from the barren schoolteacher." The way she said it, so matter-of-fact, made my chest tighten. I set the crate down and turned to her. "You ought to stop letting their words live in your mouth." She froze for a moment, then looked at me with something like surprise. "You think I do that?" "I think we all do," I said. "Let other folks' notions climb inside and start building rooms." She studied me, quiet, then nodded. "Maybe you're right." We worked side by side through the morning. Every so often, our hands brushed as we passed a plate or a ribbon, and each time it felt like a small truth neither of us knew how to name. When the crowd started filling in, I saw her shoulders stiffen the way they always did when she felt the eyes of the town. A woman near the pie table leaned to whisper to another, both glancing toward us. I caught the tail end of it. Poor thing, bless her heart. Doesn't even know he pities her. Josephine must have heard it too, because she went still, her jaw tightening. I wanted to turn on him, to say something sharp enough to silence every tongue in that hall, but she laid her hand on my arm. "Don't," she said softly. "It isn't worth it." Her touch stopped me cold. I looked at her, and she shook her head. "If I start fighting ghosts, I'll never stop." She went back to her work, her gaze steady as ever, and I felt that familiar pull again, half pride, half ache. When the fair ended and the lanterns dimmed, we walked outside. The air was cool, the scent of cut hay drifting from the fields. The moon hung low and wide, and somewhere a fiddle was still playing from a porch across town. She turned to me then, her face lit by that pale light. "You shouldn't keep standing beside me," she said. "You'll end up with the same whispers I carry." I stepped closer. "Let them whisper." She opened her mouth like she wanted to argue, but the words didn't come. The silence between us was long and full. Then finally she said, "Well, why do you care?" I thought about it, how to answer without scaring her back into herself. "Because I see you," I said. "Not what they say, not what you think they see. Just you." Her breath caught, almost a sob, but softer, and she looked away. "No one's ever said that to me before." "Then maybe it's about time." We stood there until the last of the music faded, until the night wrapped itself around the town like a blanket. When I finally took her hand, she didn't pull away. It was a small thing, but it felt like grace. As I walked her home, her fingers still resting in mine, I thought of my sister again. How she'd never found the kind of peace Josephine and I were daring to reach for. And I swore to myself, under that wide, forgiving sky, that I wouldn't let this one slip into silence. The road back to the ranch was long and dark, but for the first time in years, the darkness didn't feel empty. It felt alive, like something had shifted. Something was finally beginning. Autumn came slow to the plains that year. The grass browned early, and the air held that thin chill that told a man the season was turning, whether he was ready or not. Work got heavier, the days shorter, and every night the wind carried the smell of wood smoke from town. I saw Josephine less once the term started again. The schoolhouse filled with children's voices, and she poured herself into it, the way some folks pour faith into prayer. Still we found moments, quiet, stolen ones. A letter tucked under my saddle, a book she left on the porch with a pressed flower inside, a walk by the creek when the evenings turned gold. The talk around town hadn't stopped. If anything, it grew sharper as the leaves thinned. A man like me, unmarried, spending time with the schoolteacher folks, had already decided God had forgotten. That kind of story was too fine a thing for gossip to let go. One evening, I rode into town to mend a gatepost near the school. The sun was setting behind the ridge, a wash of rust and purple that made the windows of the classroom glow like embers. I dismounted, meaning to finish before dark, and heard her voice from inside, reading to the children. It was steady, warm, the kind of voice that could make the cruelest word sound like a promise if she wanted it to. When the bell rang, the children spilled out, laughing and chasing one another. She followed them to the steps, the corners of her mouth tired but soft. When she saw me, she stopped, a small frown creasing her brow. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "Fence post," I answered, nodding toward the yard. I mean this late, people will talk. They already are, Trevor, I said, hammering the nail home. Might as well give them something true to talk about. Her eyes softened, though she tried not to let them. You shouldn't make my battles your own. Maybe they were mine to begin with, I said. I know what it's like to live inside someone else's story. She watched me work for a while, then said, My mother used to tell me the heart's a stubborn creature. It'll build its own roads through stone if you let it. Seems yours already has, I said. She smiled faintly. Maybe. Or maybe I've just been standing still so long that the road found me. The last of the light faded, and I finished the gate in silence. When I turned to leave, she was still there on the steps, the lamplight catching the dust in her hair. Good night, Josephine, I said. Good night, Mr. Vaughn. That was how it always went between us. Careful words balancing on the edge of something deeper. A few weeks later, the first frost came. The mornings bit hard, and the horses blew steam in the corral. I rode out early most days, chasing stray cattle through brittle grass, my thoughts full of her. Sometimes, when I stopped on a rise and looked toward town, I could almost see the white square of the schoolhouse, small and bright against the land. Then came the night that changed everything. I was mending a stretch of fence south of the river when the wind shifted. A cold front blew and sudden, the kind that brings sleet and trouble with it. I rode fast, the sky already bruising dark, the air sharp with ice. By the time I reached the ranch, the storm was on me full. The men were already stowing gear, cursing the cold. I got the herd into the lower pasture and went to stable my mare. That's when I heard a shout from the road. A boy, maybe 10, was running through the snow, his breath coming hard. Mr. Vaughn, he yelled. Miss Josephine. She fell horse through her on the ridge road. The words hit like a hammer. I didn't stop to ask more. I threw a blanket over my shoulders, saddled the mare again, and rode into the storm. Snow was falling thick now, wind cutting sideways. The ridge road twisted narrow along the creek, slick with mud and ice. I called her name more than once, but the wind swallowed it whole. Then near a bend where the pines leaned low, I saw her horse, riderless, reins dragging. I followed the trail down to where she'd fallen, half covered in snow. She was trying to sit up, one hand pressed to her side. Josephine. I slid from the saddle, the cold biting my fingers before I hit the ground. Her face was pale, eyes unfocused. Vaughn? I'm here, I said. Don't move. She tried to protest, but I'd already wrapped my coat around her and lifted her to the horse. She winced, biting down on a cry. I mounted behind her, holding her steady as we started the long ride back through the storm. The trail blurred, the world nothing but wind and white. She leaned against me, shivering. I'm sorry, she whispered once. For what? For scaring you. You'd have to try harder, I said, though my throat was tight. By the time we reached the ranch, she was barely conscious. The cook's wife met us at the door, shouting for blankets and hot water. We laid Josephine on a cot by the fire, and I sat beside her while they worked. The color came back to her face slow as dawn. When she finally opened her eyes, she found mine and tried to smile. Stubborn, she murmured, both of us. Reckon so, I said, but I'm more practiced. The others left us after a while. She dozed, her breathing shallow but steady. I stayed there all night, feeding the fire, listening to the wind die down. At one point, she stirred, eyes half open, and said, "You shouldn't have come for me." "I would have gone through worse," I said. She closed her eyes again, whispering something I almost didn't catch. Then maybe I was never really alone. The storm broke before dawn. The world outside the window had turned clean and white, the kind of quiet that follows near disaster. I sat watching her sleep, feeling that strange mixture of exhaustion and awe that comes after you've nearly lost something you didn't know how much you needed. When she woke, the first light was spreading across the snow, soft and pink. She reached for my hand, her voice rough from sleep. "You stayed?" "I did." "You always do." I didn't answer. Some truths don't need saying. She squeezed my fingers once and let go, her eyes drifting closed again. I watched her breathe, steady now, and for the first time in years, the world felt merciful. That morning, as the ranch woke around us and the fire burned low, I knew I'd crossed a line I couldn't ride back from, whatever name we gave it. Love, loyalty, fate, it had taken root deep as the winter itself. And though the road ahead was bound to be hard, I knew this much for certain. I'd rather face every storm the plains could muster than live another season, pretending I didn't care. Josephine stayed at the ranch a full week while her ribs mended. The doctor came twice, a quiet man who smelled of tobacco and camphor. He said she was lucky, bruised all not broken, and told her to rest. I didn't argue, but she did. She never was much for stillness. Each day she tried to sit up earlier, to walk farther, and each day I found her by the window before sunrise, wrapped in one of the cook's quilts, watching the mist crawl over the fields. She said it helped her breathe easier. I said it helped me too. The house was never so quiet as when she was there. Even the men lowered their voices out of respect, or maybe awe. The place felt different, softer somehow, like the world itself had slowed to match the pace of her healing. On the third evening, she asked for paper and a pen. I brought them, curious. "I want to write to my sister," she said. "She worries." "Does she live far?" "St. Louis." "That's far enough," I said. She nodded, setting the nib to the page. The lamp cast a small circle of gold over her hand. She wrote slow, careful, the way a person does when they want to get the truth right, but not let it hurt. I didn't read the letter, but I could see when she reached the part that carried weight, her jaw tensed, and the pen paused mid-stroke. When she finished, she folded it neatly and looked up at me. "Would you take it to the post when you ride to town?" "I will." "Thank you." She smiled faintly. "You're good at keeping your word." "I try not to make promises I can't keep," I said. "That's rare these days." We sat in silence for a while. The fire crackled low, the air heavy with pine smoke. I found myself wanting to ask her things, what she dreamed about, what she feared, but the quiet between us felt too sacred to disturb. The next morning, she surprised everyone by walking down to the barn. I was mucking stalls when I saw her standing in the doorway, pale but proud. "You ought to be in bed," I said. "I've been there long enough to grow roots." She said I needed to see the sky again. I wiped my hands on a rag. "The sky's the same as it was yesterday." "Maybe, but I'm not." She took a few careful steps toward the horses, her hand trailing along the rail. The mare she'd been riding that night lifted her head, snorted, and came close. Josephine reached out slowly, touching the animal's nose. She didn't mean it. she said softly. Neither did the storm, I answered. She turned to look at me, her eyes catching the morning light. You always find the gentler side of things. Only because I've seen the other. Her lips curved, thoughtful. I wish I'd met you sooner. Maybe we wouldn't have been ready then, I said. Some things have to wait till the ground's worn enough to grow in. That evening, when she was strong enough to stand a little longer, we sat by the fence, watching the sky turn to copper. The air smelled of thawing earth. Do you ever think about leaving this place? She asked. Sometimes, I said, but the trouble with leaving is you take yourself with you. She smiled at that, and for a long while we didn't speak. The world went quiet around us, just the wind in the grass, the slow shifting of the cattle beyond the fence, and the steady beat of her breath beside me. On the 5th day, she told me she wanted to go back to town. The children need their lessons. She said I offered to drive her, and she didn't protest. The road was rutted from the thaw, the air full of crows. She watched the land roll by, the faintest color creeping into the hills again. I used to think the world was small, she said, that it ended at the edge of the town. But it's bigger, isn't it? Even when you can't see the end of it. It's big enough for second chances, I said. When we reached the schoolhouse, the children ran to her, their voices bright as bells. She bent to hug them, wincing a little, laughing through it, watching her there, surrounded by life and noise. Something inside me settled. I helped her carry in her books. Before I left, she stopped me at the door. You saved me, she said simply. I was just there when you fell. She shook her head. No, before that. I didn't know how to answer, so I didn't. She stepped closer, resting her hand on my arm. Whatever happens next, she said, I want you to know you've given me back something I thought was gone. What's that? Belief, she said, that not every good thing ends in loss. I watched her for a moment, then tipped my hat and walked out into the sunlight. The air was crisp, full of the promise of spring. Behind me, I heard the faint sound of her laughter mingling with the children's voices. On the ride back, I couldn't shake the feeling that the world had shifted just slightly under me. Not enough to throw me off balance, just enough to remind me that even after years of dust and silence, a man could still find something worth holding on to. That night, when the stars came out, I sat by the fire and pulled her letter from my coat pocket. I'd meant to post it that morning, but hadn't found the heart to part with it yet. The paper smelled faintly of lavender and ink. I didn't open it, though I could have. Some words aren't meant for eyes that didn't earn them. Instead, I held it close to the flame, just long enough to feel the warmth through the envelope, as if by doing so, I could keep her voice near me a little longer. By the time I finally dropped it in the post the next day, I knew what I'd known all along. This wasn't a passing kindness between two lonely souls. It was something deeper, rooted in loss, watered by grace, stubborn enough to bloom in the hardest soil. And though I couldn't see the road ahead, for once, I wasn't afraid of where it might lead. The spring that followed was slow in coming, but it came all the same. The ground thawed, and the wind lost its bite. A kind of calm settled over Redemption Springs, the sort that fools a man into thinking the hard years have finally passed. Work eased for a spell, and the McCraes paid me a few days' leave. I didn't tell anyone where I meant to go, but every man at the ranch could have guessed. The road into town was slick with mud, wildflowers pushing up from the ditches. When I reached the schoolhouse, I heard the hum of children reciting their lessons, that steady rhythm of young voices finding their way through the world. I waited by the fence until the bell rang. She came out last, closing the door behind her, shading her eyes with one hand against the afternoon glare. When she saw me, the smile was quick, unguarded. "You're supposed to be tending cattle, Mr. Vaughn," she said. "They can manage without me for a day," I said. "Thought maybe their keeper could use a lesson or two." She laughed, shaking her head. "You never stop surprising me." "Good. I'd hate to become predictable." We walked the road toward town, side by side. The creek beside us was swollen with snowmelt, sunlight flickering over it like spilled coins. She told me about her pupils, how one boy had finally learned to spell his own name without help, how another had taken to drawing maps of a world he'd never see. I listened, not because of the stories, but because her voice made them feel like gospel. Halfway down the trail, she stopped. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her tone cut through the warmth of the day. I turned to her. "All right. I've been unwell," she said, the words slow, deliberate. "Not from the fall. Something else." The ground felt unsteady beneath me. "What kind of unwell?" She hesitated, glancing at the water. "The doctor thinks it may not be serious. He isn't sure. But I didn't want you hearing it from someone else." I didn't speak at first. The wind carried the scent of willow and wet earth, the sound of the creek filling the space between us. Then I said quietly, "You should have told me sooner." "I didn't want pity," she said. "Then you'll get none," I told her, "but you'll have me if you'll let me." Her eyes softened, and I saw the fight drain out of her shoulders. "You don't know what you're offering." "I know exactly," I said. "And I'm not asking to fix you. I'm just asking to walk beside you." She looked at me a long time, the kind of look that measures a man's worth without words. Finally, she nodded. "You're too stubborn for your own good, Mr. Vaughn. Most things worth doing require a little stubborn." We stood there until the sun slid behind the ridge. The air cooled, the shadows stretching long. When she finally turned back toward town, she reached for my hand without hesitation, and we walked that way until the lamps of Main Street came into view. That night, I didn't return to the ranch. I stayed in town, slept on the cot behind the livery. The next morning, I helped her fix the fence around her garden, the boards warped from winter. She fussed over the nails I drove, said I worked too fast. I told her the boards didn't need to be pretty, just honest. As the days went on, she seemed stronger. We spent our evenings on her porch, the smell of lilac drifting from the yard. Sometimes she read aloud from her students' papers, laughing at their crooked spelling. Other times, we just sat quiet, listening to the frogs call from the creek. But there were moments, fleeting ones, when her laughter would falter, and I'd see her hand go to her side, that small wince she tried to hide. Each time, I wanted to ask, and each time she changed the subject. One Sunday evening, as the last of the light faded, I finally said, "You needn't spare me the truth, Josephine. I can stand it." She looked at me for a long time, the lamplight trembling across her face. "The doctor says there's a chance I can't." She stopped herself, swallowed hard. He says I may not bear children, even if I wanted to. I felt the words before I understood them, a slow ache that settled deep. She waited for me to speak, ready, I think, for me to step back. But I didn't move. Then he's wrong, I said. Her brow furrowed. You don't know that. No, I said, but I've known enough doctors to know they measure too much by what they can see. She laughed softly, but it wasn't joy. It was disbelief. You really don't care, do you? I shook my head. No, I care plenty, just not about that. She turned away, tears catching the light before she could hide them. You don't understand what it means for a woman, she said. Out here it's everything. A husband, a family, a name that lasts after yours is gone. It's all tied up in what they say we can give. Then maybe it's time someone proved them wrong, I said. She faced me then, her expression raw, open. Why me, Vaughn? You could have anyone. Because you're not anyone, I said simply. You're the only one who makes the world quiet enough for me to hear myself think. Her breath hitched. She didn't speak, didn't move. The silence stretched until the night itself seemed to pause. Then she stepped closer, her voice low. You don't know what you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing, I said. I'm asking you to marry me. For a heartbeat, everything went still. The creek, the crickets, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Her hand trembled as she reached to cover her mouth. Vaughn. I mean it, I said, not tomorrow. Not when the town decides it's all right. Now, tonight, if you'll have me. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks unchecked. You can't mean that. I've never meant anything more. She let out a long breath, half a sob, half a laugh. You're impossible. Only when I'm right, I said. She shook her head, smiling through the tears. All right then, she whispered. Yes. The sound of it hit me harder than any gunshot. I took her hands in mine, rough palms against her soft fingers, and felt the world shift beneath us. Slow, sure, like the turning of the earth. We stood there in the fading light, two souls who'd been told too often what they couldn't be, daring to believe in something neither of us could explain. And when I leaned in and kissed her, it wasn't the kind of kiss that promises forever. It was the kind that says forever's already started. We were married 3 days later, quiet as a sunrise. No grand affair, no preacher's sermon to make a spectacle of us. Just the two of us standing under the cottonwoods by the creek, a thin ribbon of morning light running through the branches. The mayor signed the paper, the blacksmith's wife witnessed, and that was that. She wore the same gray-blue dress she'd worn the night we danced, mended at the hem. I remember the way her hand shook as she straightened the collar of my shirt, how she smiled to hide it. I told her she needn't be nervous. She said she wasn't, but I knew better. When the vows were done, she took a breath that seemed to lift the whole world with it. We've gone and done it, she said, half laughing, half crying. We have, friend, I said, and the sky didn't fall. Not yet, she teased, wiping her cheeks. We rode back to the ranch together. The men cheered when they saw us, but she turned red and waved them off. I think she expected me to say something solemn, something about promises and forever, but all I managed was, "You hungry?" She laughed, and that sound became home to me. The weeks that followed were a blur of small happinesses. She moved into the little cabin near the barn. where the light came in soft through the east window. Mornings, I'd wake to find her already up, making coffee, humming to herself. Sometimes she'd wander out to the corral with a shawl wrapped tight, watching me saddle the horses. She said the sound of hooves in the dust was her favorite kind of music. We didn't have much, but the days felt full. In the evenings, we'd sit on the porch and watch the sun burn itself out over the ridge. I'd tell her stories from my years on the trail, half true, half stretched for laughter, and she'd shake her head like she'd heard it all before. Sometimes she'd read to me, her voice soft in the lamplight, until I couldn't tell where the words ended and her breathing began. For the first time since I could remember, I felt still, like the road behind me had finally stopped chasing my heels. It was early summer when the change came. She'd been quiet for a few days, thoughtful, distracted. One morning she set breakfast on the table and stood there, hands folded. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. I braced myself, thinking the worst. "All right." She smiled, a small trembling thing, and took my hand, pressing it against her stomach. "The doctor says it's happening." For a moment I didn't understand. The words didn't fit the world I knew. Then it hit me like thunder. "You mean..." She nodded, tears slipping free. "He says it's early, but real." I didn't believe him until now. I just stood there, hand still resting against her, feeling the faintest rise and fall beneath my palm, as if life itself had chosen that very moment to breathe. "Josephine," I said, my voice breaking on her name. She laughed, crying all at once. "You're shaking." "I've ridden into gunfire steadier than this," I said. "You sure he's right?" "He said miracles don't ask permission." I didn't trust my legs, so I sat down, head in my hands, and laughed until I couldn't breathe. She knelt beside me, and I pulled her close, the smell of her hair filling the room, warm and clean like rain on dry earth. That day we didn't work. We didn't tell the others, not yet. We just walked the pasture, our fingers laced, the grass high around our boots. She kept touching her belly as though afraid the truth might slip away if she let go. When the sun went down, I built a fire behind the cabin. We sat there long after dark, the flames painting her face gold. "I don't deserve this," she said softly. "Neither do I," I said, "but here it is." She looked into the fire, the light trembling in her eyes. "They said I'd never be a mother." "They were wrong," I told her. "They've been wrong about you from the start." From that night on, the world changed. Every sound felt sharper, the cry of the hawk over the ridge, the whisper of wind through the grass. She grew stronger, even as her body slowed her. The doctor visited once a month, shaking his head like a man afraid to believe in what he saw. By autumn, her belly was round, her steps slower but sure. I built a cradle from pine boards, planed smooth and polished till the knots gleamed like honey. She said it smelled like hope. Then winter came, early and hard. The nights grew long and she tired easily. Still, she never complained. I'd wake at night to find her sitting up, one hand on her stomach, whispering words I couldn't hear. When I asked what she was saying, she smiled and said, "I'm teaching her courage." The birth came with the first thaw. The snow was melting off the roof, the creek running fast again. She labored through the night, her hand clutching mine till my bones ached, and then just before dawn, a cry rose that wasn't the wind. A daughter. She was small and fierce. her first breath loud enough to startle the horses in the barn. Josephine laughed through her tears, cradling that tiny bundle like she'd been waiting her whole life to remember how. We named her Victoria because victory felt like too small a word. The news spread quick through Redemption Springs. Folks who once whispered now came to our door, their faces soft with wonder or shame. I couldn't tell which. Josephine welcomed them all. She said forgiveness was lighter to carry than pride. When I held our daughter for the first time, her eyes blinked open, blue like her mother's, calm as the horizon. I thought then of every mile I'd ridden, every storm I'd crossed, and knew it had all been leading here to this quiet moment between sunrise and forever. Years later, when Victoria could walk the creek's edge and call my name from across the field, I'd watch Josephine standing by the porch, her hair silvering, her hands folded at her heart. The world had given her what it said she couldn't have, and she met it with grace. Sometimes at dusk, when the light turned gold on the grass, she'd say, "We proved them wrong, didn't we?" And I'd answer, "No, Joe, we proved ourselves right." Now, when I sit alone by that same creek, old and slow, the cottonwoods whisper above me. Their leaves sound like her laughter. I close my eyes and see her there still, holding the child we were never meant to have, the wind lifting her hair, the sky wide and merciful overhead. And I reckon that's the truest redemption this land ever saw.